Okay, we are. All right. So I'm gonna go directly into Godot today. So I'm gonna open up my MMP 270 folder. For some reason it's over here. It used to be like up here. What happened? It was 11 stuff, I guess. Okay. So here's my game. And here's project.godot. Let's open that up in Godot engine. And so a little bit of this one is programming, and some of it is just creating the objects in Godot. So I'm going to open this up here. And let's see. Let's take a look at the art as well, just to refresh. So in sprites, I made some different obstacles. So I made these little like spiky flowers that are going to spike the player if the player lands on them. That look like that. And then I made these like little snake animations. Those are going to move around. Okay. So we're just going to start with the static obstacle. And one thing that we have to do, so in Godot, I'm going to go to my scenes and I'm going to open up my platformer scene and add some stuff in here. So let's see, delete these guys, simplify this a little bit. Okay, so here's my player. I'm gonna add some obstacles for the player to run into in here. And so when we're designing our level, we want to have, you know, things that are components that we can add into multiple levels. So I'm not just gonna throw obstacles directly into the level. Just like I have with my player and my rewards, I'm going to create a separate scene for my obstacle. So I'm gonna click on scenes and right click and create new scene. And I'm gonna call this obstacle. And I'll call this one static, since it's just standing still. So I know which one this is. And I'm just kind of using a generic term here. If you have like specific obstacles, like I could call this like a flower obstacle or something like that. But I'm just going to use generic terms for the demo. So this is my static obstacle. I'm starting with obstacles so they'll be next to each other just for organization. It doesn't really matter that much, but I'm going to click OK. And this one is going to be a 2D node, but we don't want just a regular 2D node. We want an area 2D so that we know when the player gets into this area. So I'm going to right click and change the type to area 2D. I'm just going to type in area, and that brings up my area 2D. I'm going to click change. And so now with an area, I need a collider. So I'm going to right click on the node, click add child node, and get a collision shape. I'm going to type in collision and get the square collision shape 2D. And then this one wants a shape. So my flower, what shape is my flower? It's kind of a complicated shape. I'll just use a circle. For now, I can change it later if I need to. So I'm going to use a new circle shape over here in the inspector. And then we need to add in our graphic. Oh, let me change the node 2D name. I'll call this obstacle static. So this is a static sprite. It's not going to be animated. So I'm going to right click here, add child node. And for this one, I'm just going to add a regular sprite, not an animated sprite. So I'll click on sprite, click create. And so now I'm going to add in my art. So I'm going to go over to the inspector, go to the texture, click on the empty, go to load, and I'm going to go to sprites. And here's my obstacle flowers. I'm going to click open. And you can see that it has 3 images, right? Since I'm not doing an animated sprite, I see all 3 images at the same time. That's obviously not really what I want. So I'm going to go to animation, and I'm going to go to H frames and V frames. So this is kind of like when we set up in our animated sprite, we can set the number of frames. So I can actually do that with a regular sprite. I can set the H frames to 2. So you can see that changes. So we're cutting the sprite in half. And then the V frames I'll also set to 2. And so now I have one image, which is what I want. And so that looks pretty good. And so now what I can think about is like this collider, is it in the right place? And so it's pretty decent. I want it to be, you know, when the player runs into this, it should look like they're actually like touching the flower before they get hurt. So this is actually pretty decent. I might make it even a little bit smaller. Oh, it disappeared because I have snapping on and my grid is too big. So let's turn off snap. And now I can make it a little bit smaller. So I actually want to make it inside here so my player will actually get into the flower before they get hurt. I don't want them to get hurt if they're just like over here. So this blue area is like where the player will actually get hurt. I want to make sure it's inside of the art. If it's too small, it might look a little weird, but as long as it's like a little bit inside, I think that'll be fine. So I think that's good. Okay, so I'm going to add a couple things into the script before we add it into our scene, but this is basically everything I need for my simple obstacle scene. Oh, I called it obstacle simple here. It doesn't really matter. Either way is fine. Okay. So let's add our script. So I'm going to click on the obstacle static, and then all the way down here, there's a script. I'm going to click on empty and click new script. And there's a version of the script in the assets. So if you just want to grab this script from assets, if you go to the 270 assets folder, go to scripts. Oh yeah, I called it obstacle simple here. So this is the obstacle simple that is the script that I'm going to recreate right now. So it should be pretty much the same thing. There might be a couple differences, but it should be basically the same. So for the path, I want to change this and make sure it's in my scripts folder. I'm going to call this obstacle static. Yeah, I'll just stick with obstacle static and click create. And so let's see, let's look at our code over here. Okay, so there's not a lot of code. I'm actually going to add one more thing in here that I think will be kind of useful. But let's just start with this. So one thing that I want to add, so if we look at our obstacle, so in the sprite, you can only see this first flower because I set the H frames and the V frames, but now I have multiple frames. So if I click on the frames, you can see that there's actually multiple different artworks that are part of the sprite sheet. And I can grab them just by changing the frame number. And so one thing that I can do is set the frame number in my variables for my script. So if I go to my script and I'll make an export variable, so I'll type export var and call this frame number, and I'll set the default to 0. In programming, we always start counting at 0. So this will take the frame number and I can change it to use different frames from my work. So what I have to do is once the scene starts, I'm going to use this func ready. So this is the function that goes when the scene starts. And I'm going to get a reference to my sprite. So I'm going to say sprite.frame equals my frame number. So if the frame number is still 0, this is the default is 0. If the frame number is still 0, nothing will happen. But if I add a flower and I change the frame number to 1, it's going to be up in the corner, so we can't really see it, but it's going to change the frame number. So we won't see it when we're designing, but we'll see it when we actually play the game. You'll see different frames. And so it's as though I'm going to this sprite and changing the frame to 1. So it'll look like that, or 2. I only have 2 frames, so I can't go above that or I'll get an error. But that way I can, you know, choose different frames here, and I can reset this default. And so when we put our flowers into our scene, we can choose the frame numbers that way. One thing that I didn't have in my example script that you might want to do, for me, it's going to be a little tricky because I have this one frame that's like from the side. So I might not want to use that, or I could make it an option. If you want to choose something randomly, this isn't something that I've actually really talked about, but I think it's pretty useful. There's a function we can use in Godot called a random number generator. So if we look up Godot random number generator, and this could be useful for lots of different things, like changing the dialogue, changing what characters show up in a scene. But this is basically just a way of getting a random number. And there's a few different types of random numbers that we can get. So I'm going to copy this code and put it in my Godot script. And I'll set an export to choose a random. I'll say export var choose random, and I'll default that to false. I guess that's making things more complicated. Let's just stick with this. Okay, so I have a random number generator. If I want to choose a frame, one thing that I have to be careful about is I have to have a whole number. I can't use like, 1.5 or something like that. So for that, I want to make sure to use an int, which is a whole number. And so I want to use rand I range, which is rand int range, from 0 to 2. Those are the frames that I have. So I can also do that. I'm going to comment this out, and I can say sprite.frame equals RNG, which is my random number generator, dot rand I underscore range. And so I'll start with 0, and I'll go to 2, because that's how many frames I have in my sprite. If you have more frames, you can just increase that number, but I have 0, I have 1, and I have 2. And so this will actually just choose a random 1, and so I'll have a different artwork each time I load the game for those different flowers. So yeah, it doesn't quite work for me because I do have that one sprite that's facing to the right. So I might take it out, but I'll leave that in there as an option, and I'll post this code. I'll update this code. So I'm just going to comment this out. Okay. So the next bit that we need to add is when we get hit by the player. So that code is right here, and it's really simple. We're just going to call a collision function on the player. So that way we don't have to worry about like dealing with all this logic stuff inside of the object itself, because multiple different objects might hit the player. And then there's also a line of code to play a sound. We haven't gone over sound yet, so I'm going to ignore this for now. So to set this up, I'm going to go back to my Area 2D. I'm going to go to the node section, and I'm going to say bodied entered. And so we're going to assume this is the player, and we're going to set up our layers and masks to make sure it's only the player. I'm going to click connect here. And so we know the body is the player, so I'm going to say body dot obstacle collision. And so that's just going to call a function that will define for the player for when we run into an obstacle. So it's a pretty simple script. That's everything we need to do. There's one more bit that we have to add before we put this into our game, which is our collision layer. So I don't think we've added this yet. Yeah, we have the NPC, but we don't have the obstacle. So we're going to add a new collision layer. So I'll go to project and go to project settings, and we can search for physics and then go to layer names, 2D physics. So we have our player layer, we have our tiles, we have our NPC. And so now we're going to call this obstacle attack. So we're going to have multiple different layers for our moving obstacle for different things that it does. So to make sure that we have different layers to use, this first layer, we're just going to call it obstacle attack. So this is when the obstacle can attack the player. So we'll click close here. And so I'll set this layer to layer 4, which is obstacle attack. I think I have to refresh this to see that. Yeah, there's obstacle attack. And then turn off the player layer. So this is on the obstacle attack layer. And then for the mask, we can just leave on player. So the only thing that can actually interact with this collider is the player. Okay, so we've got that all set up. Let's go back to our platform scene. And so to add in our obstacles, I'm going to start by adding in a node 2D to put all of my obstacles in. So I'm going to click on my main node and right click and add a child node. And I'm just going to add a regular node 2D first. And I'm going to call this obstacles. And I'll move this up here. And so I'm going to put all my obstacles in here just so it's organized. So then for my obstacle, I'm going to right click and instance a child scene and search for my obstacle. And so there's my obstacle static. I'm going to click open. And you can see it there behind the player. So let's see if we can move it. No, I'm moving something else. Let's lock the player down. And now we should be able to move it. There we go. Okay, so let's put an obstacle over here. And let's change the snap on our grid so we can have some more options for where it goes. So I'll do 16 by 16. Okay, so let's put it here. Oh, it's kind of like not quite matching. So let's do 8 by 8. Okay, now we can move it down. So there's one obstacle. Okay. And so now we gotta, if we want multiple obstacles, I can just hit Command D to duplicate it. And so let's put another one over here. And then let's set the frame number. So for this one, I'll do 1. And for this one, I'll leave it at 0. And let's start with that. And so now the last thing I have to do is make sure that when the player hits the obstacle, something actually happens. So for this, I'm going to modify the player script. So I'm going to click on the little script there. And this brings up the player script. So I've got a lot of code in here. I'm going to collapse some of these functions so it's easier to read. And so remember, in my obstacle static, when my player enters the obstacle area, I'm going to call this obstacle collision function, which doesn't exist yet. So I'm going to copy that, go back to the player controller. And this doesn't have to be on the player. I'm just putting it here just for simplicity. So I'm going to say func obstacle collision, parentheses for function, colon, new line. And so now when our player hits the obstacle, what we really want to do is communicate with our scene manager. So remember, we have the scene manager to keep track of how many lives we have and how many points we have and stuff like that. So just like we did with our rewards, where we add another apple to our item count, we're going to tell the scene manager, we just hit this obstacle. And so, if we have lives left, then, that's good. But if we don't, we're probably going to die. So the scene manager is going to calculate that for us. If we hit an obstacle collision, we're gonna, we first play an animation. Let me make sure I actually have this animation. Go to the player scene and go to the animated sprites. No, I don't have hit. I guess I forgot to make these animations. Let's see, assets, scripts, or no, assets, sprites. Character attack. Oh no, I'm in the main assets folder. I guess I just didn't make these scenes. Right. Okay, character idle, jump, talk, walk. These in my art. No, I didn't make these. Okay. I'll make these before class on Thursday. So we have these, so I can replace these with something. But for now, I'm just going to add a new animation for when the player gets hit by an obstacle. I'll call this hit. And I'll just add some frames from one of my animations. So I'll go to sprites and I'll use the jump again. Okay, so I'll just use that and I'll just duplicate it a couple times. So I'll replace that with a better animation later, but we just want to have some animation that shows that something happened. We don't want to have things happen that we don't give some sort of feedback to the player so the player knows what's going on. So now I have this hit animation. So I need to replace the hit and the dies. I'll do that before class. So the first thing I want to do is say animated sprite dot play, and we're going to play hit. And this next part is a little bit tricky. But what I want to do, so first I want to stop the player from moving for a second. So I used is alive here. I'm just going to use is moving for this one because the player is still alive. So I'm going to say is moving is false. And then I'm going to do something a little tricky, which is I'm going to set up a signal or an event so that when my animation finishes playing, then that's when I'll send the message to to my scene manager. So that's this one right here on animated sprite animation finished. So I'm gonna go to the player, go to the node, and animated sprite, and there's an animation finished event. So it's a little signal in my node section. If I double click on this, I can connect it to the player. And this is actually a pretty common thing because whenever we have an animation that happens, we don't want to have something immediately happen while the animation is happening. We typically want the animation to finish before, we have the game end or the player loses points or something like that. So the player has a moment to see what's happening and then see the result of that. So I'm going to connect animation finish to my player script. And I have a bunch of extra lines here, so let's delete those. And so what I'm going to check to see is if the animated sprite is playing the hit animation. If that's true, then we know that they just got hit. So that's an easy thing to check. I'm going to say if animated sprite, $animated sprite dot animation equals double equals for comparison. And then I'm going to say if it equals hit. So we know if we get hit by an obstacle, we're playing the hit animation. And if that animation finishes, then what we want to do is send a signal to the scene manager, which we have to set up. But we also want to set the animation, we want to set is moving back to true. So if the player hasn't died, then they can keep moving. Okay. So we have another signal that we want to add up in the top of our player script, which is signal player hit. Okay. So if we get hit, we are going to emit the signal player hit. And I think that's everything that we need to do. I'm going to ignore this part for now. I don't think we actually need that. Okay, so we're almost done. We just have to go to our scene manager. So let's go to our scene manager. Actually, we have to connect this event. So let's go to our scene. Let's click on the player. So we have our player died event here that we connected to the scene manager. Now we have to connect our player hit signal. So again, this is under the node tab. I'm going to double click player hit, connect this to the scene manager. And so we need to check if the player got hit, we need to check if they still have any lives left. If they don't have any lives left, then they're going to die. Okay, so let's check the player lives. So we can say if global.player lives is greater than let's see 0. So if we still have some lives left, then we're gonna take off a life from the player. Excuse me, I have like a little sneeze that's not coming out. Okay, let's make a little space over here. Okay, so if we have lives left, what we're going to do is just subtract a life. So we'll say global.player lives equals global.player lives minus 1. Okay, so now if the player had 0 lives or had 1 life, now they're down to 0, so they would die. So if the global.player lives is less than or equal to 0, then the player has to die. So this comes after if global.player lives is less than or equal to 0, player.dies. Do I have a dies function for my player? No, I don't. Oh, because I just have it happen if they fall here. So let's make a dies function and just put this in there. So let's put this down here. Sorry, I'm changing up the script just a little bit. So function dies. This is if the player dies. We're just going to play this dies animation. And so let's put dies here. So if they fall, then they just automatically die. That's fine. And then if the scene manager wants the player to die, then we'll call this function here. So that's a little bit simpler. So we'll say player dies. And let's print out the lives because we don't actually have metrics right now. So let's print global.player lives so we can see that value while we're testing. All right, sorry, that was a bunch of different things to add, but I think we're ready to try this now. So I'm gonna play this scene. Oh, and I got an error. Oops. Okay, so my enemy is running into my tile map. So let's check. So here's my tile map. I probably have it on the wrong layer. No, it one's on the right layer. Okay. I have this other tile map. Maybe that's the issue. Yeah, I have this other tile map that I'm not really using right now, but it's on the wrong layer, so that's probably the problem. Let's try it again. Okay, there's my player. Okay, so I got hit by the spiky thing, and you see the animation plays. It's not the right animation, but we'll fix that later. And you can see my player lives down here. So it's really small, but I had 2, now I have 1. And if I do it again, hopefully I'm gonna die. Okay, so I didn't die. Let's check and see why. Go back to our script. Oh yeah, we have to actually die too. So let's say is alive equals false. So we won't be able to move anymore. And then in our scene manager, if we die, we also need to make the game over UI visible. So that's this line of code. So let's put that here. So I shouldn't really be repeating this, but I'm just gonna leave it like that for now. I'll simplify it later. Okay. So here we go. I get hit by that guy. I get hit by that guy. Oh, I died too quick. Okay. But at least I died. So let's see what happened. I get hit once. Oh, I didn't reset my lives. Okay. Uh-oh. Okay, so if I get hit by this, I die. I have 2, now I have 1 and I die. Okay, so let's see what's happening. So if player lives is greater than 0, player.lives minus 1. If player lives is less than or equal to 0. I think this script looks fine. Oh, we need to reset my lives if I restart the game. So that's in the menu. On start press. I forget how I did that. I don't see it in here. So we can revisit this on Thursday. Actually, we're almost out of time. Shoot. Okay, so we have a couple of issues here. I'll work them out and figure out what the deal is before Thursday. But this is the basic idea. You can see the basic mechanism is working. If I run into this obstacle, I get hit and I have 1 less life. And if I jump over it, obviously I don't get hit, but I still die. Let's see if I can actually get over it. Yeah, I can. So it makes this jump a lot harder. If I was designing the level, I probably wouldn't put it on the very first platform. But but that's a good thing to keep in mind for Thursday when we start to design the level. So yeah, it's basically making this game totally impossible. But we'll fix that on Thursday. Okay.